Well, welcome everyone to End Times with Pastor Eric. Last time we looked at Revelation chapter 20, verses 4 through 6 in the first resurrection, and I think we proved very succinctly from the scriptures that first resurrection had to be number one, physical, number two, it led to Christians reigning upon the earth, and number three, it had to be in the future. And again, that was in contradistinction to the amillennial view. Now today, we're going to be moving on to talk about the binding of Satan. And I want to begin by showing you the differences that we have over a key text. Let me first read the text that we're going to be discussing. That's Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3. And then I'll be showing you both the amillennial and the premillennial view of this passage. Notice here, Revelation 20, 1 through 3, John records this. He says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things he must be released for a short time." Now, my friends, I want to show you the difference between the amillennialist and the premillennialist positions here. Let's begin with the amillennial position. They believe that what's being referred to here in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3, is that Satan is currently bound now during the church age. And he was bound because of the finished work of Christ on the cross. What the premillennialist believes about this passage is that Satan is not currently bound. Okay, and we would somewhat say, look out the window, look at the world, even in general revelation, you can determine that Satan is certainly still deceiving the nations. Okay, even apart from divine revelation. Okay, but that's how we would understand it. Second, the amillennialist would say that the abyss is where Satan normally operates. The premillennialist, on the other hand, we believe that the abyss is not where Satan normally operates, but rather it is a prison for spiritual beings. And I'll be proving that in subsequent messages from Jude 6, from 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, that yes, there really is a spirit prison, the abyss, for example, the demonic beings that had gone after women in Genesis 6, they are locked away in this spiritual prison. And the same spiritual prison is going to be used to lock Satan away in this 1,000-year glorious kingdom. And this is why when you read, for example, in Isaiah chapter 2, that one day the swords will be beat into plowshares and the spears into pruning hooks, and no longer will the nations learn war. One of the reasons that is going to occur is because Satan is locked away. Okay, and of course Christ is reigning on the earth from his headquarters in Jerusalem. All right, now the third difference is that the amillennialists believe Satan, even though bound, can still affect believers and unbelievers. In fact, they have a little saying, they'll say, yes, he's on a chain, but it's a long one. Okay, whereas the premillennialist will say, like me, no, Satan, when bound in the future, will not be able to affect anyone. And by the way, let's get back to the text here for just a moment. Notice the language that John uses, I think, really does describe a complete locking away of Satan so that he won't be able to affect anyone. Notice the language. First of all, the angel that comes down has the key to the abyss and a great chain in his hand. Now, one of the disagreements we as premillennialists have with amillennialists is they say that we premillennialists take the text too literally. Well, let me give a word of caution. None of us, not one of us, has access to the spiritual realm. We are completely reliant upon what God reveals in the scriptures to know anything about what happens in the spiritual realm. So there's no amillennialist, no postmillennialist, no premillennialist that is pope of the spiritual realm. We are completely reliant. We can't see it. We can't taste it. We can't touch it. We can't hear it. We are completely dependent upon God and what he reveals about it. So I would be very cautious in teaching people that, well, there really can't be a spiritual prison, as the amillennialist says. What they reason is, well, this is in the spiritual realm. We know these things can't be literal. I'd be very careful about that. For example, we know that the heavenly city is in the spiritual realm. Does that mean that we really don't have a heavenly city? What about in Hebrews 11, where Abraham is looking for the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God? That's a reference to the New Jerusalem. is that not a real city in heaven? I mean, is this not real? So where do we start drawing the line? What I would do when we're interpreting texts like this is just let the text speak. Just affirm that what the text is saying is that in the spiritual realm, there is some way in which these spiritual beings are really going to be locked away. Okay, think about Jesus in his resurrected body was able to appear in rooms. He was able to eat, and yet there was no physical thing that could contain him. Okay, in other words, not on earth. But in the spiritual realm, we don't know what the metaphysics are. So we're completely reliant upon what God reveals. So notice the language. There's going to be this abyss. The angel has a great chain in his hand, and notice what he does. He lays hold. The term lay hold there, krateo, literally means to seize or to arrest. He arrests the dragon, and then what does he do? Well, he's going to be bound, deo, for 1,000 years. Baulo, he's thrown into the abyss, and then Cleo, it's shut, and then Sragizo, it's sealed over him. The language is heaped up here by John to show us that Satan is certainly going to be locked away. Not only is the abyss shut, it's sealed over him. Could John be any clearer that in no way is Satan going to be able to affect people or things? Now, I'm going to show you later that the amillennialist has a very specific definition of what they believe Satan does when he deceives the nations, and I'll show you it's not a very good reading in my opinion. But let me just say this. The language here, I think, really does show that Satan will not be able to affect anyone. Okay? Think of this analogy. Let's say someone is thrown in prison, and they're thrown in prison because they're a murderer. Okay? Well, just because they're thrown in prison and they're locked away from the rest of society because of murder, it does not mean they're going to be allowed to steal. What the amillennialists, the reason I say that is the amillennialists will say that the sealing of Satan for 1,000 years in the abyss only prevents him from deceiving the nations, from bringing a final rebellion against the church. And they believe that that happens at the Battle of Armageddon. That's what they believe. So they have a very specific definition of Satan being bound and sealed in the abyss for 1,000 years. What I'm saying is, I don't buy it. I think the idea of Satan being bound means he can't affect anybody in any way. Again, a murderer who's put in prison isn't allowed to steal, even though he's there specifically for the purpose of murder. The binding of Satan doesn't just prevent him from leading a catastrophic assault against the church, as the amillennial says. No, it prevents Satan from doing anything. He will not be able to affect human beings, whether believers or unbelievers, for that time period. Okay? I think that's the clear reading of the text. But let's go on to show you more of the amillennialist claims and their position. The amillennialist believes that Satan is bound at the first advent of Christ through his finished work on a cross. Notice here, the amillennialists believe that Satan was bound by Christ's finished work on the cross. They believe that Revelation 20 verses 1 through 3 depicts the current age in which Satan is bound. So if you look down here, this is the amillennialist scheme. They believe the finished work of Christ is what bound Satan. Then what they do is they believe that he's going to be bound for the church age. And again, they believe that he can still affect people, he can do a lot of mischief, but he can't lead the nations in a final assault against the church. That's the only thing they believe that Satan is being bound and prohibited from doing. Okay? Number two, the amillennialists believe this binding still allows, again, for Satan to operate in this world and influence both unbelievers and believers. And again, I don't think that that's a good reading of the text in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3. Third, amillennialists believe Satan's place of binding, the abyss, allows him access to people on earth today. I'm going to show you that that's not true. I'll actually prove it from Luke 8:31. Okay? But again, let me give you a little bit of a rebuttal here from the premillennialists. But before I do, let me go through our schematic. This is more of a premillennial, for that matter, pre-tribulational, premillennial time scheme, if you will. So what we believe is Jesus' finished work on the cross prevents Satan from having accusations that can stick against the Christian. In other words, Satan is depicted in Revelation 12 as making accusations against Christians, but because of the finished work of cross, there's no merit to his accusations. Satan can say, hey, God, all these Christians have broken your law, but the problem is Christ paid the debt. So his accusations have been nailed to the cross, as we see, for example, in Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. Okay, they've been done away with. All right? So then what happens, though, is during the church age, you just have people who are going to be coming to faith in Christ, and every time God is going to have to overcome the hardness of the human heart through the regeneration of the Spirit. But what happens is there's going to be 7 years that come in the future called the parousia. It's the return of Christ. And what I believe happens is that this time period, the Lord returns to rapture his church, brings us to heaven. There's also a kicking out of Satan that we'll read about in Revelation chapter 12. Satan is going to be thrown down to the earth. After the wrath of God is poured out on the earth, Antichrist has his reign. He leads a rebellion against God at Jerusalem. Christ returns, smashes the rebellion, and then sets up his 1,000-year kingdom. But as he smashes the rebellion, he's going to put Satan in this abyss where he can no longer affect people for this 1,000 years. After the 1,000 years, he's going to be released for a short time. When he's released for a short time, he's going to bring the battle of Gog and Magog about, which is the final rebellion. It's the most lopsided battle. Well, the Armageddon was as well. But this will be a very lopsided battle where fire will come down from heaven, devour the enemies. Satan, all unbelievers, will be thrown into the lake of fire, and we get the eternal states, the new heavens, the new earth, and the new Jerusalem forevermore. Okay? That's the scheme of the premillennial position. Now, let me bring up our rebuttals here. First of all, the question I would ask as a premillennialist to the amillennialist is, when was the work of the cross undone? Remember, it says in the text of Revelation 20, verse 3, that Satan will be, after the 1,000 years, released for a short time. Well, remember, the amillennialist believes that Satan was bound by the finished work of the cross. So if the finished work of the cross is what bound Satan, and yet Satan is going to be released, that must mean the work of the cross is undone. Well, that doesn't make any sense. The work of the cross, which again, the amillennialist believes is what bound Satan. Again, we believe he's going to be bound at the second coming, not the first coming. Okay, so the question for the amillennialist is, when is the work of the cross going to be undone? It doesn't make any sense. Number two, why does Revelation 20 verse 3 say Satan cannot deceive the nations any longer if he is not deceiving the nations during the church age? There's actually an adverb that's used, eddy, which can be rendered still or any longer, which denotes the fact that Satan was deceiving the nations. Okay, now, to be fair, the amillennialist will say, well, that was before the church age, but I'll show you that that's not valid. Okay, certainly what's being stated in Revelation 20 verse 3 is that Satan was already deceiving the nations. Okay, according to the adverb, which is rendered any longer in the New American Standard Bible. In other words, he was already doing it when he was bound. Okay, third rebuttal. How can the demons in Luke 8:31 request Jesus not to send them into the abyss if amillennialists are correct in asserting that the abyss is where Satan and the demons normally operate? Now, I'll come to this in subsequent messages, and perhaps even today we'll get into this, but let me explain what was going on. Do you remember in Luke 8:31, you can read about the passage later today, or whenever you get a chance tonight. Think about Luke 8:31. Jesus is casting out these hordes of demons and this demoniac. Remember, they were many. And they implore him in Luke 8:31, the demons do, they say, please do not send us into the abyss. Remember, the amillennialist position is that the abyss is not a real spirit prison, but it's the normal sphere in which the demons and Satan operate. Why? Because they believe that Satan and the demons can affect us. Now, I'm not saying that all demons can't affect us. Some can. But when they're locked away in the abyss, they cannot. Okay, and we'll talk about angelology and demonology and all of that in subsequent messages. But here's the point. Listen carefully. In Luke 8:31, the demons request of the Lord, please do not send us into the abyss. If the amillennialist is correct that the abyss is where the demons normally operate, then Luke 8:31 doesn't make any sense, because the demons would be saying, Lord, don't send us to where we already are. Are you with me? If the abyss is the realm in which Satan and the demons normally operate, well, then the demons would be saying, Lord, please don't send us where we already are. It doesn't make any sense. No, the abyss is a spiritual prison. The reason the demons didn't want to go there is because they wanted to remain active. That's the idea. So certainly it proves that the abyss is really a spiritual prison, as the premillennialist says. Number 4, Satan's binding so that he may not deceive the nations does not mean he is free to deceive believers. Is a criminal in prison for murder allowed to steal? Again, the amillennialist has a very particular definition for Satan being bound. Again, what is their claim? They're claiming the only thing that Satan is prevented from doing is leading a final assault, they believe, that occurs at the Battle of Armageddon, that Satan will use the nations to accomplish. That's the only thing they believe that he is prevented from doing during the church age. Okay, so when you and I say, well, obviously the New Testament shows us that Satan is very active, therefore he's obviously not bound, they say no. The only thing in Revelation 20 verses 1 through 3 that Satan is prevented from doing is leading this final assault against the church. Listen carefully. My point is that, think of an analogy. Think of a criminal who commits murder. He's in prison for murder. He can no longer murder. Why? Because he's in prison. But because he's in prison for murder, does that mean he's not being prevented from stealing or committing larceny or some other car theft? Well, of course not. He can't do anything like that. The same thing applies to Satan. When he's bound, it's not just that he can't deceive the nations and bring an assault at the Battle of Armageddon against the church, as the amillennialist says. No, that is being pedantic. No, he can't do anything. He is bound. He can't affect believers or unbelievers. And I'm going to show you in the next slides that certainly Satan is doing those things that he will be prevented from doing, and he's doing them now in the church age. Let me give you some examples. Let's start building the case that no, Satan is very busy now during the church age. He is clearly not bound. 2 Corinthians 4, 3 through 4, notice what Paul says. He says, even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world, literally the term world there, aeon, is age, has blinded the minds of the unbelieving so that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Now, who is it that's blinding unbelievers to the truth of the gospel? Well, it's the God of this age, right? The God of this world. Well, who is that? Well, it's Satan. That's what he's referring to. So certainly, Satan is deceiving unbelievers. Unbelievers, that is individuals, comprise the nations. Okay, so we can't get so goofed in our head that we think, well, the nations in Revelation 20 verse 3 are just corporate groups. No, the nations are comprised of individuals. And so Paul is revealing that Satan, the God of this age, is in fact deceiving the individuals that are unbelievers that comprise the nations. Okay, well, certainly, therefore, he's not bound as depicted in Revelation 20 verses 1 through 3. Okay, let's go on to some other texts. Notice here 1 Peter 5:8. Peter says, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Dear ones, how is that possible if, in fact, Satan is bound during the church age? Okay, and by the way, Peter here is writing to believers. Let's make a greater to lesser argument like the rabbis used to. Jesus used this. If the greater Christian who has the Spirit, who's regenerate, who sees the truth and has a love for the truth, if we have to be on guard against the devil, how much more, obviously, can the devil affect the unbelievers who comprise the nations? Certainly, dear ones, it's absurd to believe that Satan is currently bound. Let's keep going. Romans 16:20, very important point that Paul makes here for our purposes. Notice he says, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus be with you. Wait a minute. I thought the amillennialists said that Satan was bound at the cross. Well, wait a minute. Paul seems to be indicating that Satan can still affect us because he says, well, God will soon crush him. The term soon there is the noun takos. It's used really adverbially here. Okay? The idea is this is something imminent. Why? Because the return of the Lord at his parousia is what's imminent, and that's where Satan will be crushed and bound. Okay? So again, we as premillennialists say that the binding of Satan occurs at the second coming, not as the amillennialist believes at Christ's first coming. And it's proven by this text. Why is Paul saying this to Christians that, again, Satan would be soon, literally imminently, crushed under their feet? Well, obviously that had not happened yet during the church age. Okay? Here's another one, 1 Timothy 1:20. Notice he's talking here about church discipline. Paul says, among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan, so that they will be taught not to blaspheme. The phrase, whom I handed over to Satan, what that means is they were handed over in church discipline, meaning they're excluded from the assembly. The idea is that the assembly is the abode or the realm of God. Outside of the assembly, that is of the church, is being handed over to Satan. But again, the idea is that Satan is certainly active. Okay, let's keep going. Let me show you some more verses. Here we have Acts 5:3. Remember Ananias and his wife Sapphira. They sold a property, and yet they withheld some of the proceeds and lied to the Holy Spirit. Notice Peter, it says, said to Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back some of the price of the land? Here we have an individual that comprises one of the nations, right? And he has his heart filled by Satan to lie to the Holy Spirit. So certainly Satan is depicted as being active. Again, what does Revelation 20 depict? When Satan is bound in the future 1,000 years, he's going to be chained, sealed, and shut in the abyss. John could not have been any clearer that he will not be able to affect anyone. So, again, this I think disproves the amillennial position. Certainly Satan is active during the church age. Here's Paul's admonition to husbands and wives. 1 Corinthians 7:5, he says, stop depriving one another. Again, he's talking about the normal sexual relations between a man and his wife. Stop depriving one another except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now remember, this is written towards Corinthian believers. Okay, the idea is that we have to be in a physical relations between a man and a wife. We ought not to deprive one another too long, because Paul, as an apostle speaking for Christ, knows that we are weak human beings and can succumb to sexual temptation. Okay, so the idea that Satan can tempt us, that is, deceive us, even believers, again, is a very important argument, because the believer is greater. The unbelievers that comprise the nations are less. If the greater Christian can be deceived, how much more the lesser individuals who comprise the nations, how much more can they be deceived? That's an argument that I would make. Think about 1 Thessalonians 2:18. Paul says to those at Thessalonica, for we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, more than once, and yet Satan hindered us. Wait a minute. Satan is active enough to hinder the Apostle Paul in his plans? Well, certainly Satan could not have been bound, therefore, at the cross. Why? Because he's still active, even hindering the Apostle Paul. 1 John 5:19, here it's very important. John says, we know that we are of God and that the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. By the way, the term world here probably refers, remember, if any of you have ever read the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, there's 3 usages of the term world. The first usage of the term world has to do with simply everything that God made. It's all of the stuff of the cosmos. I don't think that that's the point that Paul's using here. I don't think he's using world in that way. The second type of usage for the term world or cosmos is the idea that the world is the arena of human affairs. The third option for world is that the world is a reference to unregenerate humanity in their rebellion against God. I think that that's certainly how John is using world here. So the idea is that the whole unregenerate world is what? In the power of the evil one. How is that possible if in fact Satan was bound at the cross, as the amillennialist says? Dear ones, again, their position, and again, I'm saying this, I love our amillennial and postmillennial brothers and sisters, but I just don't think it has merit. Okay, let me give you one more. 1 Timothy 5:15. Notice here Paul says, for some have already turned aside to follow Satan. Now, by the way, let me explain a little bit about what that saying was about. 1 Timothy 5:14, one verse prior to that, Paul had talked about younger widows. He says, please get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach. So when he says for some, he's talking about some young widows had already turned aside to follow Satan, meaning they got into unhealthy relationships. They started having sexual relations with those that weren't their husbands or believers, etc. Okay, that they were involved with the world once again and were no longer really living for Christ. Okay, so again, how can that happen if Satan has been bound? I think, dear ones, clearly Satan is not bound. Now, how does the amillennialist react to that? Well, let me explain the definition that they have for the binding. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the amillennialist has a very specific definition of what the binding in Revelation 20 verses 1 through 3 is about. Let me read Sam Storms. Sam Storms, very thoughtful amillennialist. I like him a lot. He loves the scriptures. I read his book. I think it's like 500 some pages. It's called Kingdom Come. Let me read from it. And he's a very good amillennialist. Let me read his definition. He said this, Sam Storms, he says, although Satan may and will do much in this present age, as the New Testament epistles clearly indicate, he acknowledges that, there is one thing of which John assures us Satan will never be permitted to incite and organize the unbelieving nations of the world in a final catastrophic assault against the church until such time as God in his providence so determines. What Sam Storms is saying is that the only thing Satan is prevented from doing by being bound is he can't allow the nations to, the only thing that Satan will not be allowed to do is to deceive the nations so as to bring them at this final battle, the Battle of Armageddon, this final assault against the church. Okay, now again, the reason I think that that's a bad reading is certainly it does say that he can no longer deceive the nations in Revelation 20 verses 1 through 3. And certainly later in Revelation chapter 20, Satan is released and he does bring the nations against the people of God in a final battle. But again, dear ones, just think of the murderer who's locked away and is no longer allowed to murder. Again, does that mean he's allowed to steal? Okay, my point is, Satan being locked away, the imagery is that he can't do anything. Just as the demons who are currently locked away in the abyss, they cannot do anything. That's why the demons in Luke 8:31 say, Lord, please don't send us in the abyss. One of the reasons is they're locked away. They can't do anything. That's the point. And so they have to have this very particular definition of Satan being bound, because otherwise all of the data that I just read to you from the New Testament shows clearly Satan isn't bound. But I'm going to show you some other difficulties that I don't think that the amillennialist can surmount. Let me show you what they are. Let me pull up the next part of the slide here. Again, we're debating on Revelation 20 verse 3, and I want you to take note of this language where it says he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him. Now notice the purpose statement, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer. The term any longer in the Greek text is the adverb. It can be rendered still. Okay, so this is actually the Greek text. This is hina. Let me just read it. Hina me planesthi edi ta ethne. Now, what in the world is that? It simply means in order that. This is a purpose statement, or so that. You could also render it a result clause. so that he may not deceive, then here's ta ethne is the nations, edi is any longer or still. Now, why am I highlighting? I'm getting really nerdy here, I realize, but notice the edi, that's any longer. That adverb shows us that Satan was already deceiving the nations. He was already doing it. If you say that Satan can't do this any longer, implied is that he was doing it. Is everybody with me? Satan was already deceiving the nations. That's the point, and we know that from this adverb. Again, why is he going to be thrown into the spiritual prison, the abyss? So that he can no longer deceive the nations. Okay, edi, meaning he was doing it in the past. Okay, so this becomes a problem for the amillennialists. Let me try to back up from the eternal states. Obviously, in the eternal states, all unbelievers, all wicked demons, and Satan are thrown into the lake of fire. So obviously we know that Satan does not have to be bound here. Why? Because he's thrown into the lake of fire. So the amillennialist and the premillennialist agree Satan is obviously not bound in the eternal states. Okay, well here's the problem. The problem then is that it says Satan has already been deceiving the nations. Well, I think that that's obviously occurring in the church age. Well, what the amillennialist is going to have to argue is no, any longer the fact that the adverb indicates that Satan was already deceiving the nations must be prior to the cross. It had to happen really in the Old Testament age. Okay, I'm going to show you in the very next slide that that's an impossibility. Okay, but again, what I want you to see from this language, any longer, again, he will not be allowed to deceive the nations any longer. Edi, he's already doing it. And he's clearly doing it in the church age. In fact, we see in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, the great dragon, this is Satan, who was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, who was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Now, the amillennialist will say, oh, Eric, you big dope. Don't you know that Revelation 20 and Revelation chapter 12 are just saying the same thing? You see, they believe in something called recapitulation. Well, dear ones, these are not the same text. They're not talking about the same time period. Why? Because here, Satan is thrown into the abyss. Here, he was thrown down to the earth. You have to know for sure that the abyss is not synonymous or the same as the earth. So these are talking about two different events. Dear ones, when Satan is thrown down to the earth I don't have the premillennial scheme up here, but it happens in the 70th week of Daniel, I believe at the very beginning. When the church goes up, Satan goes down. He's thrown down. Why? Because the Lord will not allow him to keep making accusations against the bride, which is in heaven. Okay, well then after that 7-year period, Satan is going to be bound in the abyss for 1,000 years. So the point is, we know Revelation 12 verse 9 is not about what happens in the eternal states. It's not about what's happening in this time period. We know, dear ones, that it has to be bound earlier than that. Okay, so with that, let me show you another problem that amillennialists have with this text. Now, notice here again, Sam Storms, an amillennialist, very bright man, very good man, he says in Revelation 20, verse 3, that it is about Satan not being allowed to launch a catastrophic assault against the church. That's what he believes Satan is being bound from doing. That is the only definition. What is Satan bound and kept from doing? Amillennialist Sam Storm says Satan is only prevented from launching this final attack against the church at the second coming. Okay, that's his definition. What is the final attack? The Battle of Armageddon? That is where Satan is released. So when Satan is released, he's going to lead this final battle. That's what the amillennialist believes. So the only thing Satan is being bound and prevented from doing is launching this final attack. Here's the problem with that. When did Satan lead this catastrophic assault against the church? Because remember, he can't do it in the eternal state. Satan will be thrown in hell. We all agree on that. But dear ones, it couldn't happen during the church age. Why? Because that's when the amillennialist believes that he's bound. So what the amillennialist has to say is that, well, this had to happen in the Old Covenant time period. Since the amillennialist argues Satan is bound during the church age, and Revelation 20 verse 3 says Satan had deceived the nations in the past. Remember, he was doing it. Satan would have to be assaulting the church prior to the church age. Do you follow the logic? Again, what's the definition of Satan being released by the amillennialist? When Satan is released for the short time, they believe that's to launch a catastrophic assault against the church. Well, again, Satan can't be released during the eternal states. Why? Why? Because he's in hell. And they believe that he's not going to be able to do this during the church age. So they have to believe that this happens here, but there's no church. See, do you see, dear ones? The amillennial position makes no sense because there's no time period in which Satan could be released for a short time to launch this catastrophic assault against the church. It can't happen during the church age. It can't happen in the eternal states. It must happen prior to the cross. I think that that's a catastrophic problem for the amillennial position. Now, they will try to claim that this happens at the second coming. The problem with that is, again, Satan was already deceiving the nations. Okay, so prior to him being released for a short time, he had already been deceiving the nations. Well, think about that. Think about this for a moment. The definition the amillennialist has is when he's released for a short time, he's going to lead a catastrophic assault against the church. They believe that that occurs at the second coming. But Revelation 20 verse 3 says he had already, again, the logic of eti is he already had in the past, he already had been deceiving the nations. Well, they believe that can't happen during the church age. So it has to happen prior to the church age. The problem with their definition is their definition of deceiving the nations is to launch a catastrophic assault against the church. So when you're stuck with that definition, all of a sudden that means this has to happen in the Old Covenant period prior to the existence of the church. You see, it ends up being irrational. They don't have a place for when Satan could have been deceiving the nations in the past. The amillennial position is an absurdity. Okay, it just is. All right, now let's keep moving. Another question I think we should ask is, how can Christ's work on the cross be undone? Again, amillennialists say that Satan was bound by the work of the cross. Notice here, Revelation 20 verse 3, when it says he must be released for a short time. Well, follow the logic. If Satan, according to the amillennialist, was bound by the work of the cross, well, then the release of Satan must be the undoing of the work of the cross. So again, the amillennialist says, though, Satan was bound by the work of the cross, but he's going to be released. Therefore, the work of the cross is undone. Is that what we should believe? I don't think so. So the premillennial position is far better in this regard. Again, the question is, how can Christ's work on the cross be undone? The premillennial position is that Satan is bound in the future at Christ's second coming. Therefore, Christ's work on the cross is never undone. Are you with me? Okay, so think about it. If the amillennialist is right that Satan is bound by Christ's work on the cross, well, then his being released, the released is being undone. The binding is undone. Okay, let's make it clear. When Satan is bound, that's the work of the cross. Well, his being released is the undoing of his being bound. Therefore, that must be the undoing of the work of the cross. Again, it doesn't make any sense. But all of a sudden, when you have the premillennial position, you realize, no, Satan will be bound till the second coming of Christ. All of a sudden now, the finished work of Christ is never undone in the premillennial position. Again, a far greater reading than that of the amillennial position. Okay, let's keep moving. let's do a little bit of a review here. Amillennial problems with Satan's binding. And again, we'll get into more issues next time. But a little review. Amillennialists claim that the cross of Christ is what bound Satan. What's the problem with that? Well, why does Revelation 20 verse 3 say that Satan must be released from his binding for a short time? Again, will the work of the cross be undone? If the cross is what bound Satan, and the releasing of Satan is undoing his being bound, then when it says he's released in verse 3 of Revelation 20, it must mean the work of the cross is undone. I don't know how you escape that logic. That's a huge problem. Amillennialists unwittingly, and I know they don't believe this, but their amillennial position would lead you to conclude that the work of the cross has to be undone. That's the logic of the position they hold. Okay, number 2, amillennialists claim the abyss is where demons and Satan already operate in the realm of the earth. That's what they believe. Again, why then are the demons asking Jesus not to send them to where they already were? Again, Luke 8:31, they say, please don't send us into the abyss. What does the amillennialists say? Well, that's where they normally operate. So the demons would be saying, Lord, please don't send us to the area where we already are. It's one scholar said it this way. It's like saying, hey, I'm going to take a shark and I'm going to put him in prison. And you say, well, where are you going to put him? I'm going to put him in the Pacific Ocean. Well, that's where he normally operates. That's an absurdity. I'm going to take the shark, I'll put him in the prison of where he already operates. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, and so what I'm showing you is there's such problems with the amillennial position. I don't know how people hold to it. I, in good conscience, never could. Okay, how do you say that the demons are saying, Jesus, don't send us into the abyss where we normally operate, where we already are? It doesn't make any sense. Number 3, amillennialists claim that Satan is bound during this current age. Problem? Why does Revelation 20 verse 3 say that Satan was already deceiving the nations? If he was already deceiving the nations in the past, well, that had to be before the church age. And yet, what is the definition? The only definition that amillennialists will allow you to use for the deception of the nations is to lead a catastrophic assault against the church. So if Satan was deceiving the nations in the past, and the amillennial says that can't be during the church age, well, then it had to be before the church age, before the church existed. But the definition that they have for the nations being deceived, again, it's their definition, not mine. Don't blame me. I'm the messenger. The definition the amillennialist has for the deception of the nations is where Satan leads them to an assault against the church. So you would have to have logically an assault against the church prior to the existence of the church in the church age. That's the logic of the amillennial position. Again, none of it makes sense. Dear ones, the premillennial position, again, is very straightforward. When Jesus Christ returns and sets up his kingdom, Satan is going to be bound so that one day the swords will be beat into plowshares, the spears into pruning hooks, and the nations will no longer learn war. Yes, the people of the nations will go up and worship the Lord, as it says in Zechariah 14. And there will be one king, that is the Lord Jesus, reigning in Zion. It'll be a blessed time. We'll be in our resurrected bodies. Satan will no longer be deceiving the nations. That's why this matters. The premillennial position is straightforward. It's clear. And we don't have the logical problems that exist in the amillennial position. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time when we talk more about the binding of Satan.